Hello, Kevin DeMackey here, and today we're going to talk about fixing the creative development process. Whether you work on the client side in brand management or in an agency environment as an account manager, a creative, or a planner, you've probably run into some frustrating experiences when it comes to creative development and developing new campaigns for communications. There can be frustration on both sides of the fence when it comes to that creative process. There can be a lot of lost time, a lot of rework, where you feel like you're not getting what you want necessarily if you're a brand manager or a director or something like that and you're getting work out of an agency. There can also be a lot of lost time and rework for the agency themselves. If you're an agency partner, you can also feel like you're losing your time, your team's time, and you're having to do rework that might be unnecessary or avoidable. There's also a lot of frustration involved. Frustration at the loss of time, feeling like you're up against deadlines that maybe you're behind, frustration with having to do rework, and honestly just frustration with the outcome. Teams may feel like they get to a point where they run out of time and have to approve work that isn't their best work or that they're not quite happy with. So these are big issues and they're very common. If you work on a brand team, if you work in an agency environment, at some point, if not frequently, you're going to run into these issues. So today I'm going to talk about the typical creative development process that happens and some of the flaws in that process, and then provide some tips here that will help improve that process going forward. A typical creative development process for new campaigns typically looks something like this. First, we write a brief. Now that can be the brand team, someone on the client side, writing a brief and simply sending it to an agency. Or it could be a request to the agency so that the agency takes a stab at the brief. But many times a client is going to write or develop a brief and need to deliver that to an agency as a starting point. This brief usually contains a lot of information in many cases, and some of that information may or may not be as useful to agency teams. So what often happens is when the agency receives the brief, it often gets rewritten. And many clients aren't even aware that this is happening, that they may have a client or project brief that then the agency takes and someone or a team at the agency looks at it, determines what's important or not, and actually rewrites it into an internal agency brief. And in most cases, whether the client's aware or not, this is not delivered back to a client for alignment. It's simply a translation on the agency's part that the client may not know about. Once that happens, then the internal creative teams at an agency are usually briefed using the agency brief, not necessarily the client brief or the project brief that the client initially sent to the agency. This can obviously create some lost in translation issues once creative work comes back later in the process. The agency's creative team will develop ideas, and then in many cases, those ideas are translated within the agency into things like storyboards or scripts for delivery back to the client and for client review. Some fundamental flaws here: most times, because of this translation process the agency goes through, client teams rarely interact with the actual creatives that are going to be doing the work until later when the work comes back and is presented. Another issue here is that besides the obvious flaw that creative teams develop ideas based on a brief the client never sees, aligns to, or provides, those ideas are often translated into storyboards or scripts without client review as well. So you're fleshing out details and you're providing a more detailed creative output that takes more work and takes more time before the conceptual ideas have been reviewed or aligned to by the client. This is often where a lot of rework and lost time happens, because those detailed ideas get delivered to a client. A client may reject any or all of those ideas, and then the agency has invested substantial time, the creative teams have done a lot of work, only to go back and start at the beginning. So there are a lot of issues here that cause those loss of time and rework problems that you have. And we want to avoid those. So here are some ways to help alleviate this and help make things go much more smoothly and efficiently and help you get to better work. Ideally, there are some key things here that we build into this process. One is homework, and this is really on the shoulders of the client and of the brand team that's going to set about doing this work and set the process in motion. You have to do your homework. Now, homework can be research, which hopefully you've done in some way. You've talked to customers or consumers, and you've done some kind of research that leads to real insights and relevancy that you can build into your creative brief and your creative product. It can also be things like leveraging brand foundational tools and positioning and some of those strategic elements. Also, you're going to want to reference if needed or account for things like your marketing plans. So those kinds of homework pieces need to be done before you set about writing a creative brief and starting this process. Once you've done your homework, another thing to consider, draft your communication strategies, the strategy behind the brief and the communication. Draft that before you ever actually write a full brief that's going to go to a creative team. So if you need tips on what that means, what a communication strategy is, how to maybe work on those and draft those up before you write a full up creative brief, you can click the info bar here and go and check out that video. We have another video where we get into that topic. But what you're primarily going to be doing here is drafting your strategic options for your creative brief. So you can have an internal discussion with your key stakeholders, with your managers about what the right strategy is among those options. Once that happens, then you can write a creative brief. Another thing to consider, collaborating with your agency on the brief up front. Ideally, you have a single brief and it doesn't get rewritten into a second brief, so you don't have things lost in translation. If the agency isn't getting what they need from the way you're writing your briefs, then you should have a discussion about what they do need and how you can evolve your creative brief and the format of your brief to deliver what they need without them having to rewrite it. The other thing early in the process that helps is once you actually do write the brief, you want senior level approval on the brief itself so that the strategy is aligned to up the chain of command in your organization. As a general rule of thumb, you want the creative brief approved up to the same level that the final creative product will be reviewed and approved. There's often a mismatch here that causes a lot of conflict and rework at the end of the creative process. So if your final creative work is going to go 2 levels up or to a chief marketing officer, then the creative brief itself should go to that same level for alignment so that when you come back later, there's consistency. Last but not least, focus on ideas first. This really applies to when you're creating new campaigns and new big ideas. Now, obviously, if you have an existing campaign and you're simply doing an extension or an add-on to that existing campaign, then this may not be necessary. But if you're upstream in the process and you're developing something really new, you should be reviewing with your agency and discussing ideas first so that the details of things like scripts and storyboards and full-blown picture boards don't get in the way of the core conceptual ideas. That's where you want to focus your conversation. What are the big ideas that have potential before the agency then goes and puts more work and time and effort into blowing those out? So those are some key tips that will help overall with your creative development process. Hopefully, if you have experienced some of the things I mentioned, some of the frustrations, you can take some of these new tips into consideration and think about how you might evolve your process to make the development process smoother and get you stronger work. I mentioned previously a video on communication strategies that hopefully you'll check out if you haven't seen it already. We also have an entire series here on YouTube that you can check out and learn how to write a creative brief and the recommended elements we think you should have in a creative brief. If you found this video helpful, go ahead and hit the like button. If you'd like more tips and videos like this in the future, go ahead and hit the subscribe button. Ring the bell so you receive notifications when we publish new videos. And if you'd like more tips, training, or help regarding how to write a creative brief or the creative development process, including things like easy templates that your team can use to make things easier and make your work better, go ahead and check out the link in the description below to our training programs where we can help you with process, templates, and direct training so that you learn how to make better creative work and better creative process.